View 10.5 has a lot of new ecosystem features and also some changes to the existing features. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at all of these new features that have been added and modified. I'm going to start out by adding in just a procedural terrain that we can put an ecosystem on. I'm going to go ahead and scale this down. And we've got it about 400 meters. For the X and the Y. And we'll go ahead and just add a material to this. And what we're going to do is under landscapes, we'll go ahead and select, actually the default surface I believe has a bit of grass on it, which actually should be alright. So we'll just stick with that. And I am going to go and swap the material, so opening the material editor, taking this default surface and swapping the material 1 and 2, and then I'm going to switch it to a simple material so that we just have the rock. I'm going to edit the color and just darken that up a little bit so it's more like kind of a soil. Then what I'm going to do is add in the ecosystem layer. First I'm just going to change my background for the surface material, get rid of that checkered look. Add in ecosystem. And what we can do is add in a plant. And we'll go to trees. And I'm going to select to add in, we'll just add in the plum tree. We'll add in a maple tree. We'll do a cherry tree. And these are all the very, or lower res plants. And generate pretty quickly, better for larger ecosystems. And we'll add in a higher res plant too, using the alder late spring. Go ahead and click OK. Now the first thing you're going to notice is that the scale is now going to be set to 1 when you add vegetation. Now in previous versions of Vue, I believe version 9 through 10, you would only really see a scale of 1 if the internal display unit of the scene, if you go to File and Options and under Units and Coordinates, if that one view unit was equal to 0.1 meters, because the plants were basically created in a scene that was 0.1 meters. Now the internal unit, or the display unit, one view unit, whatever you have entered there, 1 is now the default, which is how it's been for a couple of versions now. You're going to see a scale of 1 for all the instances you add in, regardless of whatever that unit is. So basically a scale of 1 is going to equal whatever that display unit is set to. So if it's set to 0.1, then 1 is going to equal 0.1. If you have it set to 10, 1 will equal 10. So if we go ahead and populate, you can now see the ecosystem. And I'm going to switch this over to billboard, because at the moment the shaded billboard, the sizes are a little off. Sometimes if you save the scene and reopen it, it will fix the shaded billboard scale. If you're worried about backwards compatibility, all scenes created prior to 10.5, if you have ecosystems in them, will use the old scale unit. So if you're loading a scene, so if you were to say create the scene in version 10, load it in 10.5, the scale, in this case because the internal unit is 1, all of these scales would be set to 0.1, and it will retain the original scale. If you want to kind of convert them over, what you can do is remove the instance from the ecosystem population list and remove the object and re-add it in. Keeping in mind that if you have multiple ecosystems with that object in it, you will have to remove it from all of them. So it might be easier just to kind of stick with the older scales if you're working on scenes that were created in earlier versions of Vue. Unless you have minimal ecosystems where you can just easily go in and remove all the instances. In some cases, you do also have to delete the ecosystem layer and save the scene, reopen it up in order for it to kind of trigger. Another cool thing about the way the scale is set up is the ability to modify the scene scale and preserve the actual size of the instance. We'll take a look at that right now. First thing you need to do is make sure that under General Preferences and File and Options, that under Object Options down here, Preserve Size of Natural Elements Creation is turned on if you want the scale change. So what I'm going to do is go to the units and coordinates and set the view unit to 0.1 meters and click OK. And it took just a second to load the new scale, but what it did was it scaled the instances to preserve their size. So our terrain, which was around 400 meters before, is now down to about 40 meters. But the instances will stay the same, and we can preserve their size, and that's going to apply to any natural element, so trees and rocks, anything with a built-in generator, basically, in the ecosystem generation. We could also set this up to, say, 10. And then it's going to shrink down our instances. Now, if we repopulate, it will modify the density, because density is calculated by the scale of the instances and kind of groups them together and fits them, depending on the density, as close as you can to each other without them really overlapping. It does take that into account. So now with this new scale, it's going to generate a lot more instances. So we had about 1,700 before, and now there are 217,000 because the object is smaller and we're filling in a much larger area. If we take a look at the size of the terrain, it's around about 4 kilometers. If you want to prevent that scale change, if you decide to modify the display size or the scene scale, then you can turn off the preserve size of natural elements, and checking that off and then making changes to the unit will keep the scale of these object instances where they're currently at. So we could set this back to 1 meter, click OK, and now it's going to create a very dense forest because we have the density set for a smaller scale object. So now we're going to have a lot of instances grouped together. So it can be kind of an interesting way to create maybe a denser forest and modify the scale in that way if you kind of want to override the internal settings. In this case, it obviously is way too dense, but it does give you some more features you can play around with. And no matter what that other unit is set to, or the display unit is set to, you're still going to have this scale set to 1, because that is going to equal the display unit. And keep the size if preserve size of natural elements is turned on. So it's a pretty cool new feature, because sometimes it's easier to work with atmospheres or certain types of landscapes in different units, or modifying objects at different unit sizes, and that way you can kind of change over the entire scene scale, which is pretty neat.